we doing, everybody? Welcome to another episode of The Fields. My guest today, she's got quite a long title. She's a neuropathic doctor. She's an adjunct professor. She's a chief science officer. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Jamila Owens-Todd. Doctor, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me.
You are very welcome. You've done quite a bit in your life to this point, but let's start with the common denominator. Where did you get your love of chemistry from?
Always wanted to know how things worked. You know, I was the kid who was asking, well, that's good that this does this, but why? And wanted to get down to the nitty gritty, you know, taking things apart in order to put them back together. So that's just kind of, I guess, the curiosity in me, which led me to chemistry. And I have to shout out, it was Mr. Lane, my high school chemistry teacher, who just made me fall in love with chemistry. And then I took AP chemistry and thought, yeah, I need to do this and find a way to work with this in my life somehow. So,
all right, shout out to Mr. Lane. You got yourself a fantastic student over here.
Thank you.
That love of chemistry of yours actually led you into the pharmaceutical industry, yes?
It did, yeah. I was going to find a cure for cancer. That was, you know, in my youthful, naive days. Then you get into working in pharmaceuticals and you're like, oh, there's not necessarily the industry for cure. I'll be honest, I really enjoy being in the lab. I'm a lab rat. I loved it. And I wanted to take that knowledge and apply it to my interests and my passions, which even at a young age was plant medicine, using herbs and teas, being 19 and 20, tinkering with different herbal formulations. So once I found a program that allowed me to marry the love of chemistry for plant medicine, I thought, here we go.
Well, is that kind of what led you completed a naturopathic doctor's degree program at the Canadian College of Naturopathic Medicine?
Yes, a mouthful.
That is a mouthful. I read it off there. Yeah. What is naturopathic medicine? Is that strictly plant-based?
So no, naturopathic medicine is an integrative form of medicine. So when you think about your very traditional doctor, they have a toolkit that helps to heal you, right? So in a naturopathic setting, we learn the science, the pathology, microbiology. We learn how the body works, but then we learn how to apply more holistic or integrative therapies to heal you. So it's steeped in plant medicine. However, we learn things like homeopathy, which is an energetic system of healing. We learn traditional Chinese medicine, acupuncture. We learn nutrition. So a lot of nutritional supplements, food is your medicine. And then there's some physical modalities that's similar to kind of chiropractic manipulation. So it's an all-encompassing kind of course of study. And then you can kind of pick like what your route of focus will be. And mine was always plant medicine, or botanical medicine is what we would call it.
So that is what led you to start the Meridian Institute for Naturopathic Medicine.
Yes, so that was in 2007. I started my practice, which was, the focus was to coach and support patients, but also have an educational piece. So even in my practice, I always taught classes within the practice and then around the community, just getting people to engage in their own healing and understanding that a lot of the healing can start in your kitchen, you know, very basic, simple things, or you have it within you. I believe we're all healers. And so I wanted to just get that message out and continue to get that message out.
And through this whole process, you've retained your love of formulating things, yes?
Yeah, so one of the benefits of having this chemistry degree with the formulation background, even as a naturopath, I started working with different companies doing consulting. So working with vitamin companies, a few beverage companies out there, and a few like natural product companies. So along the years, as I was practicing, I had this other kind of side thing of making different formulations. And then I started formulating my own herbal tea products. And then I created a company out of that, which I still have. It's called Rootberry Leaf. So it's just one of those things where I can just see product formulations. It's in my sleep. I'm driving, I see herbs. I'm like, that should be with this, you know. And then I go home and tinker with it and try to find some way to make it into one.
Now, as you've progressed throughout your career, where has cannabis entered, and has it sort of been a steady presence for you?
Yeah, interestingly enough, when I was studying in Toronto, before I received my degree, there were patients, and we had an oncology shift, and there were patients who were using encapsulated cannabis, or it was just normal for them to use cannabis during their chemo treatments. So it was always like, here is this other herb that people can use. But coming back to the state, specifically Missouri, with it being illegal, it was always kind of under the radar. Like, patients are like, this is what I do at night. So it was a way I could support them, but I couldn't really just be open because of, your practice, and you don't want to lose your certifications and license and whatnot. And then I had a bunch of pediatric patients I was supporting with neurological deficits and changes, such as like Dravet syndrome and seizure disorders, epilepsy. And those parents were driving out to Colorado. And I thought, these people are all going to jail, but I wanted to find like the science and a way to really support them, because I'm a parent and I would do anything for my child. So to see them not only go out on a limb, but to see the healing and the benefit that these kids were getting, I thought I really need to explore this. So I got into cannabis, and then I kind of backed off and started to use CBD primarily. And that was maybe in 2016, 2017, and then just started diving into that research and implementing that more than teaching classes about it, because it was really, really new and people weren't really understanding how to apply it as medicine. So I thought, I understand the science, it makes sense. I understand the endocannabinoid system. I've studied the brain and neurology, so it wasn't a far off concept, to add that in. So it just became this natural progression. Then it was like, oh, Missouri's going to be voting for this soon and legal. So all the steps just started to fall in place, honestly.
Is there a cannabinoid or a terpene profile that works best for you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a myrcene caryophyllene. That's what I find that I like. I like a lot of I like the savory flower. I'm not a sweet. Gorillas are my kind of go-to. I need that. It's like the end of the day ritual for me. How I consume is typically with honey. I infuse honey, or I used to just add the tea, make the tinctures. I got them from a dispensary. And add them to my tea at night. So my tea, I really love tea. I can go on a whole tangent about tea, but like my ritual is to consume tea and the aromatics. And we talk about terpenes, but I always, when I teach the terpene classes, I always say, we've been using terpenes for eons. It's essential oils. So when you have that aromatic component to a food or a spice or a tea, that inhalation is the ignition of the cranial nerve. So you're getting the olfaction or a scent centers that are kind of stimulated. That's what terpenes do. So that's a part of the healing, is the smelling and activating the brain in that way. So a tea ritual for me, just like steeping the herbs, smelling them, and just kind of sitting, is like the switch to turn on the healing and the therapeutics. And so now we're identifying like, oh, there are specific scents or terpenes that we're finding in this plant. So you may have already had bisabolol or caryophyllene in your chamomile tea, and then you add in some cannabis that's high caryophyllene or bisabolol, and it's like you're heightening the effects of it. So I love that I can have these like layers of this kind of terpene component or essential oil aspect of consuming my tea. And so I'll infuse my honey, add that to it, and it's just like it's a chill time, man. It's good, it's a good time. So I like the evening just to shut me down.
Just to relax.
Yeah, yes.
So in your mind, is Indica Sativa hybrid, is that just marketing hype?
I think, you know what? I know I'll be glad when we are ready to leave those names, but I always think about it as the language that we speak. We, in America, we speak English, but if we are traveling abroad, we may speak, Mandarin in China, right? So if I don't have all of the language to communicate in Mandarin, I'm going to go back to my default. I look at Indica Sativa like that. It's the basic language that we've attached to this plant. Now we're getting more savvy and more intellectual about it, and we can speak about the true nature of the plant, which is really the terpene profile. Mm-hmm. And so I would love to kick those old nomenclature to the curb, but it's like some people come in the door and they're like, I need a sativa. So it's like, all right, I can meet you there. But let's talk about what a sativa is. Let's talk about what it is in that sativa that you love. And then we can kind of peel back those layers on the terpenes and even some of the other benefits, the antioxidants, or the many components of the plant that
like
really
flavonoids, which
the
almost no one
flavonoids.
knows about.
Right. So it's like there's so many components to it, but we are still learning all of the language to really articulate our experience of cannabis.
Well, while we are speaking of language, what is it called? Is it a strain, a cultivar, a chemovar, or a chemotype?
So, in the science world, I have to refer to it as the plant and its chemovar. I do interchangeably use chemovar and chemotype. And a lot of that is because the chemotype, I'm getting into the cannabinoid ratios, primarily THC, CBD. And then, when I get into that conversation, it's like now we're speaking the same language. It's just like when folks are saying, I've been calling this weed forever, I'm a botanical practitioner. And when I trained and learned about, garlic, we don't say garlic, we say Allium sativa. You learn the Latin because that's how you're able to communicate across the globe.
Garlic's called Allium sativa?
Yes.
Is it in the same family as cannabis?
It is not, but that sativa is just a common name that's attached to many plants. And so if I am speaking to someone in South Africa or, in Botswana or in, Colombia, I need to speak to them at the level that they're going to understand this plant, not speaking the languages that they speak locally. So to say garlic is an English term. So it's the same thing I apply to cannabis. Like I have to say cannabis because it's going to be ganja, sensi, those are all the terms I know because all my lovely, island artists give us those beautiful names. So I think it's when we're getting down to like how we communicate, we do have to use those kind of chemical terms, especially if I'm in that industry. And if I'm speaking to other practitioners or researchers or scientists. I know it's not, it's a different language for every group, right?
Well, I got to admit, when someone calls in and asks for a strain, it's nails on a chalkboard because I always tell them a strain is a virus or what you do to your back when you hurt it.
Yeah, but again, we're going back to the rudimentary vocabulary that we've attached to this plant. Until we all reach a similar level of education, then we can have that highbrow and go into chemovar, chemotype. So
do bud tenders just keep to need introducing this kind of language in their discussions with patients?
So I think as a patient care provider, we meet the patients where they are. And then when we meet the patient at their conversation of strain or indica or sativa, then we introduce the terminology that would best be suited to talk about the plant. So you don't want to cut off a patient by saying, no, we don't call it a strain, because they're going to say, I've been calling it a strain for 50 years. This young cat over here telling me not to. So it's like, well, I hear you calling it a strain. Let me tell you some new language that would be great to better describe this flower. It's
good approach, Doc.
I try to keep the patient first. I don't want to run them off, because I get people who are like, don't come to me with that cannabis beep. They're like, it's weed. And I respect that. Who am I to come in having this other conversation when this is the conversation they've been having for so long?
Well, you've been able to have these kinds of conversations with your students in the CSO program at St. Louis University. I've had quite a few guests this season who are part of that program. Tell me which one of the classes it is that you're teaching.
Cannabis Pharmacology. And so in that course, we get into some of the specific pathologies or diseases or illnesses and how cannabis can be applied, the pathway that they may help. So if it's a neurological, which is a component that I'll cover, I talk about how the cannabinoids engage the nervous system in this specific way to maybe calm a dopamine response or to engage a serotonin receptor. So we're getting into like the method of action of how this plant works at the higher level in the body. So it's cool. I enjoy it. I enjoy being able to talk about the plant in that way. And then you can really see the further and future application of it when it comes to diseases. So.
Something I've noticed our patients having difficulty with are figuring out the difference between a full spectrum product and a broad spectrum product. How would you explain that to someone?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'm going to try to steer away from controversy here because I'm in manufacturing. I use extracts. And so when we think about the plant in itself, the plant is all encompassing. Now we take that plant, we dry it, and we put some fire to it, we smoke. When we start getting into edibles and making extracts, we're losing some of those key full components of the plant. So when we get into the nomenclature, broad spectrum and full spectrum, I think it's cute. I get the point of trying to hold on to the integrity of these molecules that we lose. You do an extraction, you're losing terpenes. You're also losing what we call waste in an extraction, some of the antioxidants, the chlorophyll, all of the really wonderful parts of a plant that no one wants to taste because they're bitter. And so the reintroduction of them back into the plant, it's a method. And so those methods of reintroducing back in is where people are going to now call that a full spectrum. Really, I mean, the only full spectrum plant is just using it in its raw natural essence. So if I do a live rosin and I'm just using heat, I mean, that heat causes a degradation, right? It activates the THCA, makes it into THC. Anytime I'm changing any component of the plant, I'm altering it and I'm losing its true capacity of being broad or full spectrum. So I know I'm trying not to skirt around it because I know we use these things, but it's a lot of it's kind of marketing. I get it. The distillate that we make or that we use in manufacturing has significantly altered people's lives. It's given them a way to use this plant, apply it without the concerns of all of the other stuff, right? Or smoking or inhalation. But it's considered to be the cleanest product, but it's not the cleanest product.
I'm not going to ask you to elaborate on that. I'm not going to ask you to elaborate. Okay. You've been talking about extraction. You are also the Chief Science Officer of MiDose.
Correct, yes.
Now, what is the difference between a Chief Science Officer and a lab manager?
Oh, it's a good question. So a lab manager, so what happens is you have to have protocols in place before you go into the lab. So you're going to review, you need SOPs, you're going to need the formulation process to be outlined. You need equipment purchased. You need to have training on that equipment. You need SOPs for that equipment in order for anyone to use it. So as a lab manager, which I did have that position at one point with another company, you go in, although it was early, so I did build out I did write SOPs. But technically as a lab manager, you're controlling the flow of the process. You might do some ordering, you might do some admin stuff, but the goal is to keep the lab on task, keep the lab, it's everything's needed yesterday, right? Because that's an industry we're in. So it's more so keeping production schedules, where the Chief Science Officer is going to set everything up for a lab manager to do. So you're going to do a lot of the back end, a lot of kind of the executive functioning of the lab, responsible for training. You're responsible for, again, equipment selection. That's something
Staff selection.
Selection. So it's just more of a kind of executive position.
Sounds an awful lot like in the culinary industry, a head chef and a sous chef.
Yeah, I would imagine.
Would that be an accurate analogy?
It could be. I think the role is because then it's just a lot more. It's a many hats role, because then there's the marketing. You might have to write out copy for that, or where a lab manager as a CSO. So you wouldn't necessarily ask a lab manager. If you had a lab manager with that skill set, that would be great. So you do a little bit more about not just the production of the product, but the sales of the product, the follow through, the testing. It's just you're wearing many hats, I guess.
What would you say is a good starting dose of cannabis for someone that hasn't consumed before?
Yeah, I know in the regulations, and we've always heard 10 milligrams. That's too high from my experience. So most of my patients, if they're not pediatric, they're geriatric. So I've kind of changed my practice to focus on two specific groups. And part of that is some of that's a natural flow. Because I do a lot with neurological deficit and diseases and disorders, it's either going to come very early or it comes very late in life. So that tends to be the population. I have seniors who, are very aware of 1.5 milligrams of THC.
Wow.
So it's, and mind you, I'm using cannabis in addition to other plants and herbs. But the introduction of 1.5, the most people are very aware that dose is there, it's present, and it's comfortable. Now, I typically will ramp up to 2.5. So my focus is microdosing, mostly with patients. And my goal is to not exceed 5 milligrams. It depends on the condition. So if we're looking at Parkinson's or dementia, or because we need good feedback, we need the patient to feel comfortable. You can see signs when they're irritable, and that can happen at 5 to 6.5 and even 7 milligrams for some of these patients. And so often I'm trying to manage that and give it really for its benefit of kind of regulation, always in tandem with CBD. So if I had to just throw a number out there, I would say 5 milligrams, but I'm usually in between 1.5 to 5 with my patients.
And for your patients, what would be the best dosing method?
Yeah, it's always dependent on the patient. I'm often shocked at people who want to consume via inhalation. Obviously, well, I don't want to say obviously, but most of my patients want it in an edible form. That would be maybe 75%. Very few want to inhale, but there are some who, even with cases of anxiety, I get more patients who don't want to inhale and they have anxiety, which we've always heard that's the quickest method of action, and which it is. So those patients, I'm usually trying to find like some nanotechnology, sublingual, and they're doing it in combination with something else.
Between hydrocarbon, alcohol, CO2, and solventless extraction,
No.
What is your preferred method?
Don't ask me that.
Well, okay, what do you have the most fun playing around with? How about that?
Distillate is fun. You can do so much with it. I have to say, I am, this is going to sound really probably horrible, but I don't like the concept of extraction. And when I say that, I get into heated arguments about hydrocarbon extraction and CO2 extraction. I was first trained on CO2 extraction. Now, I've done extractions in the chemistry setting with essential oils. So because that was my first training in the cannabis setting, CO2, I definitely have an affinity to it. Hydrocarbon, I am one of those people who's just like, why do we need to inject butane into this process? And then I get all the folks who
You can get more terpenes out of it.
And I know it's like you get higher yields. I get it. You're trying to do some diamonds, shatter, butter. Hydrocarbon is the way to go. I am a fan of the whole live rosin. I love that, just very natural. Make some bubble hash. Buy an old washing machine and get some bags. I feel like that's like, how our ancestors would have used it, just through these little ice washes and very simple extraction, or like the bang lassi, where they're just literally banging the leaves, on a sieve, or, some burlap or something. So I'm definitely a purist when it comes to those. But I have to admit, it's fun working with distillate. You can be very creative. I've been playing with nanotechnology and water-soluble technology, and it's really cool. And you can do that with the distillate. So it affords you that ability to make a whole, plethora of new products. But
Well, is that the future, nanotechnology? What about beyond nanotechnology? Because I've heard about sound wave extraction and things of that nature.
I saw, and there is a guy who's doing that somewhere in like Central Africa, who's doing the sound wave. It doesn't seem to be a stable process, but that's the only person that I've heard doing it. I think it's cool to consider all the different methods. I would love to see sound wave and infrared and all of these other forms, but I think I won't say I have a preference, but I will note that the CO2 training, and that was like, I was always the CO2, like only do CO2 because that was considered the purest. But I have since changed my tune. I can be converted on many things. I'm easy.
Well, that's going to do it for another episode of The Fields, folks. Thank you to Utopia Experience for this wonderful studio. Show would not be the same without you. We'd be back in the Field State Conference Room, and while I was grateful for that experience, this is a far higher quality product. So, Utopia, thank you guys. Also have to thank this episode's sponsor, SOA State Farm. They are right next door to Field State and Florissant, and not only do we love working with local businesses, they have top flight service. Let me share a really quick story. I took a couple of days off this past spring for a trip to Kansas City, and the day of my trip, I got a letter in the mail from my former insurance company saying, oh yeah, by the way, we're going to raise your rates by 75% with no explanation. So rather than cancel my trip, I called SOA State Farm. Not only were they able to get me a new policy, I was able to have it done while I was on the road. I did not lose coverage in transit. So if you want good quality service, go to SOA State Farm in Florissant. And they're not going to be there for too much longer. They got a new building that they're moving into, so check them out soon. Thank you to today's clothing sponsor, Don't Triad Co. Now, this shirt right here, they're going to be changing their logo, they're rebranding. So this is actually going to be a collector's item. If you want to get what they have left of Don't Triad Co., go down to Hustle City on South Taylor Street. That's HUSTL3C1T4. I had to think about that for a second. Check them out on South Taylor Street. Excellent clothing selection. And thank you to my guest today, Dr. Jamila Owens-Todd. Thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy schedule. I know you were just at a conference. We didn't get a chance to talk about that. But the fact that you were able to fit this into your schedule, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Doc.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm so honored, and I really appreciate you reaching out. Thank you. And look, keep up the good work because you are rocking it on this scene. So I'm so happy for you. I wish you so much success.
Thank you so much, Doc. I really appreciate it. And thanks to all of you out there for watching and checking us in. We'll see you next time.